This study examines the mobilization and assertion of political power in the Jamaican Black Caribbean community in Toronto during the mid and late 80s. This is the 20th century. Using the Paddy War of 1985, I will argue that bureaucrats, journalists, and politicians attempted to correct, control, and change Jamaican Canadian citizens through the community's cultural contributions. This cultural artifact, the beef patty, was a visual representation of Jamaican culture and identity in Toronto. The political mobilization to defend this food product demonstrated active discursive citizenship and disrupted the hegemonic pressures of Canadian society. For this research, I used local community newspapers from the Black Caribbean community in Toronto. I also examined mainstream local and national newspapers, plus the Jamaica Gleaner from Jamaica. Louder? Okay, sorry. My quantitative data came from Manpower, which is, it's been renamed, and Immigration and Statistics Canada. My periodization begins in the mid-60s to the late 80s of the 20th century in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. After changes to Canada's immigration policy starting in the mid-50s, Jamaicans gradually became a large demographic force in this country. The highest point of migration was between 1973 and 1977. In this period, Jamaicans became the fifth largest migrant group, making up 5.2% of the total migrants who arrived. In the 1974 Immigration Statistics Report, 9,992 Jamaicans settled in Ontario out of over 11,000 already settled. Toronto would become the home of the largest Jamaican community in Canada, with a strong West Indian core. Consequently, Jamaicans and other Black Caribbean migrants developed cultural associations and opportunities for small service-oriented businesses. Being excluded from mainstream society through direct and indirect racial discrimination encouraged a Black business class to emerge, and the necessity of sustaining a cultural sense of community was essential for well-being and survival. This meant bringing a little bit of home to Canada with them. So these are advertisements on the right-hand side in some of the Caribbean newspapers. This is Share Magazine and The Islander. Advertisements for Spence's Bakery. So if you've been on Eglinton Avenue West, you might see this still, and the Pepper Pot Restaurant. And as you see, they both sell and they bake patties and all types of Jamaican cuisine. So the Jamaican beef patty was one food item that made it to Canada from the island of its birth. This small meat-filled pastry is thought to be a descendant of the English or Cornish pasty, the meat turnover native to Cornwall, England. According to Michelle Garcia of the Washington Post, the beef patty was born of colonialism and migration. Historian Barry Hickman goes further by stating that the Jamaican beef patty can be placed in 18th century English cookery as a meal for the rich using large quantities of meat. And one of the first known recipes for the beef pasty or patty can be found in Hannah Glass's Art of Cookery, made plain and easy in 1747. So this is a Cornish pasty. Beef patties were native to Jamaica, and there was no need to identify them as Jamaican beef patties. By the 1960s, these pastries had become a democratic food available to one and all. Portable, filling, inexpensive, they had come a long way from their Cornish ancestors, originally enjoyed by the wealthy. The beef patty of Jamaican origin was part of the nation's fabric, growing and evolving alongside this newly independent land. In early February 1985, inspectors from the Federal Department of Consumer and Corporate Affairs, unfortunately known as CACA, went to various Jamaican bakeries in Toronto and put them on notice. Apparently, the beef patties that they were baking and selling were in violation of the newly revised Meat Inspection Act of 1985. By law, food items labeled ground beef patties were expected to consist of beef meat only, with at least 10% meat protein, no more than 30% fat, no filler ingredients, and definitely no crust or pastry should be encasing the meat. Under Canadian laws, whatever these Jamaican bakeries were making could not be labeled as beef patties. The food inspectors instructed the bakeries that they had 90 days to correct this error or face fines of up to $5,000. That meant changing the name on everything, from the packaging, the signs, the advertisements, and more. Peter Hadel, the lead inspector of CACA, suggested Caribbean pie to prevent confusion. How many people have had a Caribbean pie? Okay. The Jamaican community was outraged and in utter disbelief over this controversy. Why did the Federal Food Agency show up in 1985? Beef patties had been in Canada since the first wave of significant migration during the late 60s. The beef patty had been in Canada as long as a significant Jamaican community had been here. The first newspaper to pick this story up was Share magazine on February 14th, 1985. Share is one of the most popular and respected newspapers in the Caribbean community in Canada. The large circulation. I believe it's online now. It's no longer, I don't know if it's in print anymore, but it's still in print? Well. Patty sales threatened by government regulations. It's at the very bottom left right here. Michael Davidson of the Kensington Patty Palace was interviewed and became the de facto face and spokesperson for this conflict. Davidson was quoted as saying, quote, "Patties are a part of our heritage, and if I called them anything else, my Jamaican customers wouldn't know what I was selling," unquote. Bakeries, businesses, and members of the Jamaican and Black Caribbean community in Toronto mobilized to fix this matter and to defend their food, their identity, and culture. Sunday, February 17th, the story went global as the Jamaican Gleaner put the patty on its front page. Canada bans the patty. So alarming and grabbed the attention of Jamaicans everywhere. Why would Canada ban this baked food product? The Gleaner reported that since the beef patty had surpassed sales of the hamburger, the federal government was intervening on the hamburger's behalf. They would also include reports from Share magazine and the Toronto Star. In addition to what was happening in Toronto, the Gleaner reported on February 19th that Prime Minister Brian Mulroney of Canada will be making an official visit to Jamaica for an economic regional meeting with other Caribbean states. You know, cultural and formal diplomacy. Jamaican Prime Minister Edward Seaga did not make any official comments on the matter, nor did the office of Canada's Prime Minister. However, now that the patty wars had become international news, it could not be ignored for much longer. So on the right, you have a political cartoon. Imagine changing our name at our age. A feisty damn feisty, the patties say. So Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, his administration ruled Canada starting in 1985, a conservative in the footprints of US President Ronald Reagan. Mulroney attacked crime, taxes, and immigration by creating legislation that affected certain communities and demographics. I'm not going to say what his intentions were, but they seemed to affect people of color disproportionately, especially in Toronto. The provincial PC government ruled uninterrupted in Ontario for over 50 years. They did not really cater to Black constituents either. So who would advocate on their behalf? On February 18th, Ontario opposition leader, Liberal David Peterson, made an appearance at the Kensington Patty Palace to show his support for the pastry, the bakery, and the community. This was a powerful visual endorsement for the beef patty and the Jamaicans of Toronto. He later released an official statement saying that, quote, "The federal government's unilateral decision to force West Indian Canadians to rename their national snack food, the beef patty, is inane. While the Caribbean patty has been in existence longer than any arbitrary definition of a meat patty set by federal regulations, officials outdid themselves in insisting that traditional snack be renamed Caribbean-style beef patties," unquote. When I interviewed the Right Honorable David Peterson, he said that Mulroney's government was symbolic of a change in sensitivity. It was a different world. This patty war, he said, was a metaphor for bigger things, much larger things. There was a lot more stuff going on than we were aware. It wasn't just patties. This beef, as he put it, was bureaucratic stupidity and utter cultural insensitivity. I think he was fond of the Mulroneys. I don't know. I think he was cool with them. On Wednesday, February 20th, both the Toronto Star and the Jamaica Gleaner announced that the patty war had come to a timely end. On the second page of the Toronto Star, Rosie DiMano declared, "Patty war treaty settles vendors' beef." A picture of Michael Davidson on the left and Lloyd Perry, the so-called official patty representative and official patty guardian, was standing outside the Kensington Patty Palace, holding a tray of fresh-baked beef patties. Perry recalled that the Consul General of the Jamaican government in Toronto specifically asked for his help and advice in this matter. This issue was larger than Toronto and even Canada. It had affected the entire Jamaican diaspora. Really, though, it was the entitlement of the federal government that they felt they had in trying to change a food product or the name without consultation from the community. The patty is older than Canada itself. It is a descendant of a pasty, a truly Commonwealth creation. Because Jamaicans were culturally and numerically significant, the beef patty was now a part of Canadian culture, all part of Jamaicans and their cultural diplomacy. Canada needed to embrace the patty and Jamaicans as Canadian citizens. David Peterson's public adoration of the patty and Jamaican people would not soon be forgotten. Alvin Curling, a member of the Jamaican community, received an endorsement by Peterson to run for the Liberals in Northeast Scarborough. Curling won in a landslide victory in a by-election April 1985 and became the first Jamaican Canadian member of provincial parliament in Ontario. The voting power of the Jamaican and Black Caribbean community was acknowledged for the first time in recent memory. By next province-wide election the next year, Peterson's Liberal Party won in the most lopsided victory in Ontario's history. By supporting the Black and Jamaican communities in 1985, David Peterson had gained motivated political allies. He used the good wealth left by Pierre Trudeau and the Federal Liberal Party and used a lot of political competitiveness in order to wrest control from the Conservative Party of Ontario. It appeared that the Jamaican beef patty was in least part the catalyst for this Liberal win. The Jamaican beef patty prospered in its many incarnations after the war in 1985. Bakeries expanded and catered to fans of all ethnicities and backgrounds. Stuffed with different meats and vegetables, they were customized for a Canadian marketplace. This democratic, affordable food paired with cocoa bread and a soda made a complete meal for many students for fewer than $5. In Toronto, patties are now sold in school cafeterias, subway stations, hot dog carts, movie theaters, and even correctional institutions. On February 23, 2012, Mayor Rob Ford of Toronto proclaimed the day as Jamaican Patty Day in Toronto and noted that, quote unquote, Toronto is a city made up of people from around the world who brought with them their culinary diversity that has made Toronto a hotspot for the best in flavorful and tasty cuisines, unquote. Ultimately, Mulroney's administration underestimated the political power and significance of this diasporic community. February 1985 became the moment that Jamaicans stood up, defended, and defined themselves as a collective in Toronto's history. The construction of a positive, accurate, and meaningful identity in Canada can be difficult and problematic. Jamaican Canadians saw themselves as active Canadian citizens, but were not treated or recognized as such. Jamaicans and other Black Caribbeans, but focus on Jamaicans today, worked as cultural diplomats, protecting the patty and asserting a discursive citizenship, recognized and acknowledged in the Canadian public space. Jamaican beef patties, along with other consumable cultural artifacts, are intrinsically tied to its island of birth. If we are what we eat, food and its history should be respected, protected, and seen as essential to the development of culture, identity, and representation. Where's the beef? In Canada, it's definitely in the beef patty. Thank you.